Hidden away among the canyons, mountains, and deserts of the American Southwest can be found mysterious ruins, which often date back over 1,000 years in time. Places where countless generations of people once lived out their lives in a world that would seem totally strange to us today. These ancient ruins have now become a treasured part of our national heritage, for they are all that remain of our very first cities. Cities built by Native Americans in their own unique style, many centuries before Europeans began to settle on this continent. In this program, we will learn how our first cities developed and discover how the remarkable stages of their development relate to the great eras of European history. Over 12,000 years ago, the earliest humans to inhabit the American Southwest were small tribes of hunting families. These people had no permanent homes. Instead, they simply wandered from place to place, searching for wild game. However, as the centuries passed, less rain fell, and the grasslands that fed the animal herds dried up. With less wild game to eat, hunters were forced to spend more time gathering food materials from desert plants. And so, over the centuries that followed, these tribes pursued what is called a hunting and gathering way of life. Then, about 2,700 years ago, the great civilization of Greece was growing in influence, and not long before the first Olympic Games would take place here in ancient Olympia, an unusual hunting and gathering tribe called the Anasazi started to establish permanent settlements all across this landscape, not far from where the borders of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. By building these simple communities, the Anasazi people had unknowingly taken the first step in the creation of a marvelous new civilization that over the next 18 centuries would build the largest and most fantastic of our prehistoric cities. The Anasazi abandoned their old nomadic way of life because they had started to farm, for they had realized that agriculture could provide them with a more dependable supply of food than hunting and gathering. At first, they raised only corn, but later they farmed squash and beans as well, using seeds from plants originally domesticated in Mexico. Because farming tied them to a single location, it made sense for them to build permanent homes for themselves. So they constructed small villages and caves near their fields. But farming brought other changes as well. For example, Anasazi women now spent quite a lot of their time grinding the dried corn into flour. Even though they still continued to crush wild fruits and berries to add to the stews of meat and corn flour that were the mainstays of their diet. And because at this time the Anasazi made no pottery objects, but wove fibers from yucca plants into the sturdy baskets that they used every day, archaeologists refer to this period of their development as the basket maker stage. The basket maker Anasazi continued to live in simple cave communities for many centuries, but around 1,500 years ago, things started to improve as they began to build new style houses and use new devices that helped make their lives easier. Across the Atlantic Ocean at this same time, around 5 centuries after the birth of Christ, the great empire based here in Rome had just collapsed, and the stability that Roman rule had brought to Europe was rapidly disappearing. In contrast to the great marble buildings of Rome, the new-style Anasazi dwellings, called pit houses, were very humble affairs. But they were still a great improvement over their earlier homes. Pit houses were constructed partially below ground and were entered through an opening in a roof that was made of sticks and covered with a layer of packed mud. It was also around this time, between 500 to 700 AD, that many Anasazi started to leave their cave communities and build entire new villages alongside their cultivated fields, as they learned to hunt with bows and arrows and to make clay pottery for the very first time. At this time, around 1300 years ago, Western Europe was in the middle of a period called the Dark Ages, and was witnessing almost continual warfare between many rival kingdoms. Owing to the violence of the times, rough wooden castles like this one were a fairly common sight over much of the continent. Also, simple Christian churches like the one seen here were becoming commonplace in European towns. It was in the midst of the Dark Ages, around 1,150 years ago, that the Anasazi began the construction of 6 small cities called pueblos here in the Chaco Canyon region of northern New Mexico. The largest city, called Pueblo Bonito, covered 3 acres, had up to 800 rooms, and was home to an estimated 1,000 people. Its construction took over 150 years to complete and employed some very advanced techniques in stonemasonry. And the timbers for its roof had to be hauled in by hand from forests about 30 miles away. It is thought that about 100,000 logs were used constructing the large pueblos at Chaco Canyon. Archaeologists built this model to show us what Pueblo Bonito might have looked like in the year 1050. As we can see, the city was built like a large apartment building. It was 5 stories high and had many doors leading from the rooms onto the open balconies and courtyards where most of the work was done. The Chaco Canyon Pueblos at the hub of its civilization, the Anasazi created a system of long, straight roads that radiate out to distant villages in all directions. And although they lacked the wheel, horses, or pack animals of any kind, evidence has been found that the Anasazi traded with jungle tribes that lived thousands of miles to the south. For example, tropical bird feathers like these have been found in Anasazi ruins. During the era of the Dark Ages, the most advanced of the Anasazi's southern trading partners were the Mayans, who built large and oftentimes elaborate cities. However, their most important long-distance trading partners were the Toltecs of central Mexico, who created the fine buildings and statues seen here. Modern-day archaeologists are fairly certain the Toltec people taught the Anasazi several of the construction techniques they used in their Chaco Canyon pueblos. About 900 years ago, the Anasazi entered a marvelous new stage of development of their civilization called the Great Pueblo Period. This stage occurred during an era of European history called the High Middle Ages. In Europe at this time, hundreds of new stone castles of impressive size were replacing the earlier wooden versions. Knights on horseback competed in tournaments, and magnificent new churches seemed to be sprouting up everywhere. It was during the High Middle Ages that beautiful new Anasazi cities like this one began to appear in the huge caves that dot the cliffs of the southwest. And one place in particular, this flat-top mountain in Colorado called Mesa Verde, became the site of many of the finest Great Pueblo communities. It is still a mystery what caused the Mesa Verde people to begin the extremely difficult task of building these remote new cities, a task that required hauling tons of rock up over very steep terrain. But it seems likely that they were motivated by fear of hostile tribes. Unfortunately, since the Anasazi lacked a written language and left behind only simple pictographs similar to these, we will probably never know for certain why these great cliff cities were built. But it is an interesting coincidence that their construction occurred shortly after the migration into the Anasazi homelands of huge numbers of Navajo people, whose modern-day descendants now occupy most of this region. Although there is a lot we will never know about the Anasazi, we do know that the Mesa Verde people of this era kept domesticated turkeys and dogs and ate both for food. We know that they created elaborate irrigation systems to bring precious water to their fields. And we also have a good idea of what their houses looked like on the inside, even though the rooms seen here were actually built by the Salado people of southern Arizona. Because they had few possessions, their rooms contained only the bare necessities of life: a few grinding stones, pots for cooking, and some drying corn. And these rooms also must have been quite smoky because they had no chimneys, and fires were almost always kept burning in them. Anasazi communities always possessed a unique feature which distinguished them from other southwestern villages. These were the circular underground rooms called kivas that were entered through the roof using a ladder that passed down through a smoke hole. It is believed that each family group or clan had its own kiva, which was used for religious ceremonies and was also a place where men passed the time together, often as they wove cotton fibers into cloth. Because many different clans lived in the larger Anasazi cities, lots of kivas had to be built. For example, the number of kivas at Pueblo Bonito was 38. Inside a kiva, a fire would have illuminated sacred wall paintings like these, in which masked dancers holding ceremonial objects are surrounded by magical-looking birds and fish that conjure up images of abundant rain and fertile crops. The floors of most kivas contained a small hole like the one seen here on the right, called a sipapu, which symbolized the opening where all living things were believed to have come out of Mother Earth. Some Anasazi cities had very large kivas that are called great kivas. This great kiva, located in Aztec, New Mexico, was constructed partially above and partially below ground. Archaeologists think that because of their size, great kivas served as places where special religious ceremonies were performed that required the participation of all the clans within a community. It is thought that the large vaults on either side of the central fire pit in this great kiva may have once been covered with animal skins and played as sacred drums. Starting a little over 700 years ago, the Anasazi civilization changed dramatically as tens of thousands of people abandoned their homes and headed south, so that by the year 1300, virtually every Anasazi city stood empty. In the case of Mesa Verde, its cities were almost new, having been occupied for only a few generations, whereas cities like Pueblo Bonito had been lived in for over 4 centuries. Although no one knows the exact reason, there can be little doubt that lack of moisture, overpopulation, and decreasing soil fertility combined to force the Anasazi from their northern homelands. As a result, people from Mesa Verde migrated to new lands that had a more reliable supply of water along the upper reaches of the Rio Grande, not too far from today's city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Once again, they planted fields of corn and built new pueblos, this time using bricks of sun-baked mud called adobe. This pueblo at Taos, New Mexico, is a living example of one of these new-style Rio Grande communities. And the Anasazi people were living within the walls of dozens of pueblos, similar to the one at Taos, when Europe entered a great era of cultural rebirth called the Renaissance, about 600 years ago. Because the Renaissance renewed people's interest both in knowledge and trade, Christopher Columbus became inspired to sail west from Europe in 1492 on his first voyage to the New World. Columbus's discoveries brought a flood of well-armed adventurers to North America, men who came not only to search for gold, but also to convert the native people to Christianity. One such man, Hernán Cortés, personally oversaw the destruction of the Aztec Empire of Mexico, which fell to Spain in 1521. And not long after the conquest of Mexico, Spain decided to add the homelands of the Anasazi to their rapidly growing list of possessions. Then, in 1540, an expedition led by Francisco Coronado rode out of Mexico to explore these new lands. As a result, later that year, the Pueblo people got their first glimpse of the men from Spain. It is impossible to imagine the fear they must have felt as Coronado's mounted expedition came into view, but it must have been like encountering aliens from another planet. For his expedition consisted of 300 soldiers, 1,000 Indian allies and slaves, plus 1,500 horses and mules. This was the first time the Anasazi had ever seen horses, animals not native to the New World. And they had certainly never before seen the strange men clad in metal armor who perched on the horses' backs. Coronado's arrival in the Southwest brought immediate trouble, for warfare soon erupted, and the Pueblo people first experienced the deadly force of gunpowder, the brutal wounds of Spanish lances and swords, and the vicious bites of their war dogs. Eventually, having no weapons to match those of their foes, the Pueblo people were forced to accept Spanish rule. So it was that in the year 1610, the city of Santa Fe was established as the permanent capital of the Spanish province of New Mexico. Although rule by the Spanish was never really welcomed, they did bring many things quite useful to the Pueblo people, such as cattle, wheeled vehicles, peaches, sheep, cucumbers, horses, and iron tools. But with the Spanish, and then with Mexicans and the Americans that followed them, there came colonists. And yet, in the 19th century, when these photographs were taken, in spite of the powerful influences brought by these foreigners, the people of the Pueblos had still managed to keep their languages and traditions alive. In fact, most of them continued to live much as they had before Columbus sailed to the New World. Perhaps the biggest change in their lives was that they had come to accept Christianity, for churches similar to this one were now to be found in almost all of their villages. And yet, even adopting a new religion did not bring an end to their old ways. Instead, the old and the new lived side by side and even blended together. And to this day, many of the old traditions continue to be followed in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona, places that the descendants of the great Anasazi, the builders of America's first cities, still call home.